Hello, everybody. I'm David Schuster reporting from Lebanon, Connecticut. This is a special edition of Quick Hits News. We're broadcasting to you live over HAPS TV. So good of you to join us tonight on this, the evening of the 2020 November 3rd election. What a campaign this has been. We've got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the legal challenges and issues that may come up tomorrow. We're also going to look through some of the campaign commercials that struck us as interesting. And we'll just get a general sense from all of you about some of the questions that all of you have. You can join the conversation live over HAPS, over Twitter, Periscope, Facebook. All of your questions will pop up on our little screen, and we will answer them for you, or we will try. But I am pleased to be joined tonight, if I can move my cursor over fast enough, by Kenneth Delvecchio. He is the legal editor for Quick Hits News. Ken, how you doing? So Ken is a longtime lawyer. He has tried more than 500 cases. Some of you may have seen him on Fox News, on I-24 News. He's been a legal analyst for a variety of organizations. He was also a judge for several years, a prosecutor, and now works as a criminal defense lawyer who also does some entertainment law. And Ken, we're honored to have you as part of the Quick Hits News team as our legal editor and analyst. I want to start, Ken, and we're going to get to some of the questions that people are already going to start bringing to us in just a sec. First, what are the legal issues you see tomorrow bubbling up that are worth keeping track of? So those are all the things that, for example, I'm going to put up a picture of, I'm going to take down the picture of Trump and Biden, put up a picture of what's going on in D.C. right now, because I think it's alarmed a lot of people. There are businesses that are literally boarding up Washington, D.C., and that they're putting up extra fencing around the White House. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about, sort of whatever sort of spillover might come as a result of people being frustrated by the election?
It is, and it could start even while people are voting, because there's exit polls, as you well know, that are going to be coming out. People are going to start getting potentially frustrated, irritated, angry. And I really should point out something that I've been talking about during all this looting and rioting. These people largely think they're going to get off scot-free. What they're not realizing is that the police, who they're asking to defund and who they're throwing bricks at and doing all kinds of atrocious illegal things against, they're accumulating something called evidence. And in 2020, there's something very heavy in evidence called video. And almost all of these acts are on video. People drive up to these stores with their cars, their license plates brazen. They're probably only wearing masks so they can cover their faces for the crimes. But the reality is they're going to be found out, and they're going to end up getting prosecuted en masse down the road. So as a criminal defense lawyer, take some free legal advice from me. And I'm going to look at you while I'm saying this. And I'm going to look at you really closely. And I'm going to tell you.
I'm not going to go looting tomorrow night. I'm not going to go looting.
Yeah. Free legal advice. Don't do it, because you're going to get caught.
Yeah. Now, what about as far as the polls themselves? What about in terms of at the precincts, at the places where people go to either fill in their ballot or, there's always election problems. There are always ballot machines that don't work. There are offices, there are polling places that are not staffed when they're supposed to. What goes into, you've been a judge before, what goes into a judge's decision to, say, extend the polling hours by an hour or 2 hours?
Look, this election specifically is very ripe for voter fraud. I'm going to show you right here. Here's my ballot, okay? Ready to go. It's in two different envelopes. What would be, David, the safest route to avoid voter fraud? Again, this has nothing to do with politics and should have nothing to do with politics. For nearly 150 years, we were able to do voting in the United States as follows. You took paper ballots that are like in this one, and that's a good thing about these mail-in ballots. They're paper ballots. You were able to take them, you were able to go to a voting station. You were able to get a paper ballot there. You fill it out, and they put it into a box. They put it in a box on a table with no trap door. Like, they can't be magicians and have a trap door where the ballots can fall out. At the end of the night, how about this? Take 5 Democrats, take 5 Republicans, take 5 independent people, and I'm going to tell you why I'm giving this example to get into, and you can pepper me with questions about it, to get into legal challenges in today's world. Take the ballots out of the box, count them up with these 15 different poll workers watching them at thousands, tens of thousands of polling stations across the country. You have almost no chance of voter fraud there. Why? Because you're just taking paper ballots out and you're counting them with 15 different people in small groups. You can't have a conspiracy. I think you alluded to already, David, even with machines, there's all kinds of potential fraud, right? They can be rigged electronically pretty easily. Now, with these ballots, you could take them, you could throw them in the garbage. So please ask me a direct question that I can answer to you as a former judge with my judge hats on, like if such and such type of problem comes up, and I'll try to answer it.
Here's a good one. Bowie must forgive me. This, and again, we've got 18 live chats going so far in just a couple of minutes, and we're talking with Ken Del Vecchio. He's a legal analyst for Quick Hits News, among other things. Ken, what do you think about people with guns at the polling locations? And I think on that question, we may have lost Ken. We seem to have a little connection problem. So I'll give the answer until Ken is able to get back in. What do I think about people with guns at polling locations? Look, if people are in a state where they're allowed to carry weapons wherever they go, then that's one thing. But if people are not allowed to bring in guns or weapons or firearms or knives to any sort of a polling location or precinct, that if they bring it, that's against the law. And that's clear intimidation if people break the law like that. We live in a society, though, where states and sometimes county by county can decide for themselves what they allow. So, look, I mean, if people feel the need to have a gun at a precinct, if it's for their own
Okay, I'm back. My connection had cut out for a second.
Stab at that question. I was taking a stab myself. What do you think about people who bring guns to polling locations? And I was trying to make a distinction.
I am having audio issues.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can now, yes.
Okay, so people who bring guns to polling locations, and for the sake of argument, Ken, let's just assume that this is not in a right to carry state, that this is simply people who want to intimidate somebody else. What do you do?
Well, look, if it's not a right to carry state and nobody has the legal authority to be able to carry a gun, my square advice as a criminal defense attorney would be don't carry a gun because you're asking for yourself to get arrested. In a state that's right to carry, and then I'm coming out on the exact opposite. People have a Second Amendment right. And I mean, I can go very broadly here and say that everybody should have the right to carry under the Constitution, but I don't really think that's the question you're asking. If you're just simply asking, people obviously shouldn't be carrying guns if they're not licensed to do so. It would be a very foolish, stupid thing for them to do because why get themselves jammed up? From a pure morals perspective, again, I'm a great believer in the proliferation of people's Second Amendment rights, and they should be able to carry. But I don't want to see anybody get into a gun battle over anything, much less voting tomorrow, because there's enough problems already.
We have a question from Deli Mata, the question about election-related lawsuits around miscounting late ballots. What do you make of the sort of legal fight that seems to be shaping up? President Trump has already indicated some of his aides that he's going to take legal action to keep Pennsylvania from accepting ballots after 3 days after the election. Where do you see some of these legal battles going?
It's a really screwy legal issue because you first got to start with the Constitution like you should with everything, especially when you're talking about suffrage rights. Nobody should be prohibited from their ability to vote. And so I'm going to start backwards a little bit on this. Like, what about people who show up at polls and they get turned away from poll workers? Or what about because of the hysteria that's been caused over the past 7 months that people are waiting on lines, they start getting antsy, the lines are because of all the craziness of trying to keep people socially distanced and so forth, and then they don't get the vote. Can they come back and vote a day later? No. So people who are lazy or who turn in their ballots late or who try to use this mass mail-in system and they handle it wrong, if they don't get their ballots in time, too short, too late, tough crap. I have a problem with the legal system allowing a presidential election, which always is volatile, this year it's more volatile than ever, to create more anxiety, stress, and fear and confusion by delaying these election results for any more time than the night of, unless there's some really extraordinary circumstance. So I don't like the Pennsylvania law that allows there to be 3 extra days to allow ballots to come in the first place, much less to extend it beyond 3 days. Is it unconstitutional to extend the voting receipts by 3 days or the counting of it? I don't think so. I think, though, it's problematic, and I think that there's other legal rationales other than flowing directly from the Constitution of why not to allow these votes to be counted in perpetuity. Where do you draw the line?
What about some of those states? I mean, look, I think Pennsylvania is one of the states where they actually start counting. I may have this wrong. They may be, I'll have to look this up. Pennsylvania may be one of the states where they've already been allowed to start counting early ballots. But I know there's some states where they're not actually allowed to even start counting the, hundreds of thousands of early ballots, early votes until Election Day itself. So in addition to having to count the ballots that actually cast at precinct locations, you've got state workers who may be overwhelmed counting all these other ballots. Should they be given a little extra time, given the deluge of effort that they have to undertake because of so many things that have piled up?
First, starting to count ballots before the election, that's a really crazy proposition in and of itself, because how are you going to trust these people to keep the vote tallies private? You start releasing vote tallies, they get leaked, and that could really influence the election. Could that be considered a campaign contribution in a twisted kind of way by counting votes early and then releasing the results or spreading rumors about it? On the reverse side, I do think you need to give as much time as is practicable and reasonable. Those are the words that the court should be evaluating: reasonable and practicable to count the ballots. Because again, we revert to the Constitution. People have a right of suffrage. They have a right to not only cast their vote, but to have their vote count. So given all the problems that we're consumed with, at its core, we can't start by taking away people's rights in not allowing them to be counted. But I have an inherent distrust of the people who are counting the votes, who are basically politicians. And that could swing in either direction as a problem depending upon the locale. So I want to see it timely and practicable and reasonable manners.
Well, I got the answer in terms of states and how the ballots are pre-processed. So early ballots are processed upon receipt. In other words, anytime in the last couple of weeks in Arizona, Georgia, Minnesota, Nevada, several other states, but I'm just reading the battleground states. Before Election Day, so at a period, so for example, in Michigan, they actually started processing their early ballots today. It was last week for Florida, Iowa, New Hampshire, North Carolina, and Ohio. And then actually on Election Day, all those early ballots start getting processed in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. So Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, 2 states that people are worried about perhaps not having an accurate count by tomorrow night. Brett Walker makes a point in terms of chain of custody, because you're talking about voter fraud. And Brett Walker asked us on the live chat, I dropped my ballot into one of the many ballot boxes in the city. There was a chain of custody. He says, therefore, talk of fraud is a scare tactic. Your reaction?
It's certainly not a scare tactic. I mean, it's just obvious. You don't need to be a former judge. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand how ripe the mail-in ballot and mass process can be ripe for voter fraud. I mean, you're taking an envelope like I keep showing here, and inside this envelope is my actual ballot. All you got to do is open up this envelope, check and see that I'm a registered Republican. And if you're a Democrat and you're shady, you can take these ballots en masse and just toss them in the trash can. If you're a Republican and you're an evil person, you can do the reverse thing to a Democrat. It's so easy to discard these items that it makes it very, very obvious that this is a terrible system. Why not, again, ask anybody here who's clicking in right now, who's sending over messages to us. I ask you, come up with a response to me about why we can't do what we did for 150 plus years and just have the votes counted that are filled out in paper ballots in a polling station. There's no chance of fraud there. A conspiracy is literally impossible. You would need like hundreds of thousands of people to be involved in it.
Speaking of early ballots, the totals are in now, Ken. 98 million early votes were cast before tomorrow. That compares to 128 million total votes that were cast in 2016. So roughly 30 million shy if you're going by 2016's figures. Some people had thought that the early ballots this time around might actually exceed the total from 4 years ago. It came up a little bit short. But given that, I mean, 98 million ballots that have to be processed, whose responsibility is it tomorrow to make sure that they're processed fairly and accurately? I assume it's state by state, right? It's up to each election official in particular counties and the secretaries of state to make sure that all those ballots that were cast early, all the ballots that are cast tomorrow, are counted and counted accurately.
Yeah, it's a consuming process. So the ballots are going to get picked up by various individuals and brought to the Board of Elections in every county. Now, the Board of Elections, in theory, is supposed to be a nonpartisan group. You're supposed to have one or two Republicans and one or two Democrats and maybe an independent that are part of the Board of Elections. All the ballots come into them, and then them and their staff will, quote unquote, process them. They'll take them out of the envelopes, they'll check off who's voted, and then they'll start the counting process. If something goes wrong during this, then that's where the court battles open up. And you know that there's thousands of attorneys, literally, on both sides that are ready for all kinds of court challenges based on anything from ballots that don't have verifiable signatures, ballots that are filled out incorrectly, ballots that have other procedural defects, and then judges are going to be on call and in large groups to be deciding all these different issues. And there's going to be more than ever. We're not finding out on election night unless there's some monumental landslide in one direction who's winning, and that's sad.
Ken, when you, in terms of a nightmare scenario, as an attorney, as a judge, what would be your nightmare scenario, putting aside partisanship, but just in terms of something going wrong at the polls or some anomaly, what would be the thorniest legal issue that you can imagine playing out tomorrow or tomorrow night?
Well, there's the obvious of what if a state's very close, like it was in Florida in 2000, and now you're relying upon the combination of mail-in ballots that are coming from people who are ordinarily absentee ballots, mail-in ballots in these newer states that aren't used to the mail-in system. And there's a couple that are used to the mail-in system in higher volume. People who voted early in person, people who voted day of in person. I think that the craziest, scariest proposition are people that are actually going to be potentially turned away at the polls because of the fact of all the hysteria that's been created over the coronavirus issues. You're going to have a different phenomenon in person tomorrow that we've never seen before. Ordinarily, you could be waiting at polls long. Now there's going to be social distancing. People are wearing, people are going to be compelled in certain places to be wearing masks. There's people that are agitated. There's volatile situations that are erupting. There's all this premonitions of the riots and the looting that I feel like people's voting rights are going to be subterfuged, where either people are going to leave out of being tired or scared, or people are going to end up getting turned away, or the polling is going to have to be extended by a couple hours. What you asked that question earlier, is a judge going to have to make a decision to extend the polling hours? I bet that's going to happen in multiple locations, and a judge has to extend the polling hours, right? If you're going to allow people to vote up till 3 days for votes to come in and get counted up to 3 days afterwards, then you're going to have to extend it for people voting in person. The whole thing is the legal system is going to be overindulged.
I'll agree with you in terms of a nightmare scenario. I had to go to Tallahassee, Florida for 35 days back in 2000. I was at the Fox News at the time, and it was the Florida recount. And of course, Florida, nobody knew who won Florida. And that was the state that was going to push either George W. Bush or Al Gore over the 270 threshold. Al Gore won the popular vote, but again, because of the electoral college system, the electoral votes matter. And for the life of me, I don't think anybody still knows quite who won the state of Florida, because there were so many different standards that the judges and the county officials had in terms of how you count ballots, and because of the chads and the punch hole system that they had, it was a mess and it was a disaster. So I would say I think you're right on that. That's another nightmare scenario. If one particular state is so close that it triggers an automatic recount, and that's the state that's going to determine this election. And I think people are a lot more sophisticated and perhaps even higher energy now in terms of the legal fights. There's a comment here from somebody regarding the question about showing up in person to vote as opposed to voting early. And somebody writes, even in Iraq, and this is a 35-foot throwaway, writes, even in Iraq, they show up in person under threat of terrorist attack threats. Yeah, I mean, I can tell you from 2005, from covering the first Iraqi election after the war, that there were people who were waiting in line, and a suicide bomber would walk up and blow himself up. Some people would get, the suicide bomber and several others would get killed, but people were so determined to vote, they simply cleaned up the mess and they walked around it. And this went on. And there were, several suicide attacks. And then people, of course, got the thumb on the inky ink on their thumb to sort of prove that they had voted. I mean, that's the sort of determination they had. The question is, do we need something that draconian where people have to go through such circumstances to vote? Or can we as a society figure out an easier way and a safe way that's free of fraud for people to vote early if that's what they want to do, or if they have some issues in terms of disability and not being able to physically get to the polls?
Wow, David, it is a scary, scary proposition laid out there. I don't think in the United States that we have to be that concerned as what's happened over there in Iraq. Unfortunately, I don't think that the percentage of people who will actually vote if those circumstances exist in the United States would be too great. I don't think that the amount of people that probably voted in Iraq percentage-wise was too great under those circumstances. I'm a firm believer in voting in person. I don't think that there is anywhere near the level of fear that people have from the totality of all these circumstances that we've been discussing tonight and that have been discussed over the past several months for people to be worried about voting in person for the coronavirus. As you know, although I recognize that the coronavirus is real, I think it's the same exact thing as the flu with an even lower death rate factually. And I don't think people should not be turning out because of the fear of that. I don't think people should not be turning out because of the fear of the looting and the rioting. I don't think that people should not be turning out because they feel like they're going to be delayed. I believe that if we did what I'm enunciating now for the third time, if we just had paper ballots at the polls, we'd eliminate almost all voter fraud, have people, here's a way legally to help also eliminate it. Verified signatures, showing ID. The showing ID is an old topic. It seems like a boring one at this point, I guess, because of everything else.
Jay just asked, Jay on our live chat is asking what needs to happen legally to have voters produce legal identification in order to vote. Why don't you take that question? But also, would you support uniform voting protocols across all 50 states as opposed to 50 individual messes of how to vote?
The latter question first. Although I'm a great believer in states' rights, the 10th Amendment is a critical a part of our Constitution. I think the 10th Amendment has been massively abused over the past 7 months where governors have run amok with power control. So I am in favor of uniform voting, a uniform voting standard. So I'm going to say it for the fourth time. And that uniform voting standard should be voting in person with written ballots with 15 different people. 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, 5 independents watching the votes get tallied. As far as the gentleman's question about the ID, you have to get ID to purchase alcohol. You have to have ID for about a list of like 20 different innocuous minor items. Why not? What is the negative on showing ID when you go to vote? How could that possibly be in detriment to, let's say, Democrats' rights? Because it seems like Democrats are the ones that argue against this. I've asked this question legitimately so many times. Are Democrats arguing that Democrats are less sophisticated and they therefore don't have means to obtain ID or do not have uses for ID, like everybody else?
Let's suppose you were talking about, I don't have a car, for example, in New York City. We've got one now because we're living in Connecticut. But let's just assume people who don't have cars don't necessarily have a need for a driver's license. So let's just suppose that I'm somebody who doesn't have a driver's license. Maybe I don't have a social security card. Maybe I'm out of work. Maybe there's no particular identification that I happen to be carrying around.
Well, look, again, what's the chances of that somebody has no need for a driver's license, no need to purchase things like alcohol, no need to verify their existence to go out of the country, with a passport or something like that? I mean, the amount of people who are in such circumstances is so minute when you counterbalance the little trouble and little inconvenience that it may be to them to go out and get an ID to vote. The weighing process clearly weighs out to help eliminate voter fraud. Let them get an ID. I just don't understand the argument against it. I mean, is it a libertarian argument?
The weighing process, it's a legal balancing test, right?
Yeah, and in the legal balancing test, it clearly weighs out that the right to try to avoid voter fraud outweighs the minor inconvenience it does to somebody in going out and obtaining an ID. And remember, it is a right to vote, but you do have to comply with certain requirements in order to cast your vote. Like you have to fill out a ballot in the first place. You can't just call up if you want and say, hey, here I am. I'm telling you who I want to vote for. You can't send it in via video. You have to complete a ballot of some form. So why not extend that to showing ID? I don't understand any legal rationale. Why not?
Rosanna writes in our live chat, Kenneth, voter fraud is brought up every election by the Republicans, but has never been proven to exist in a material amount. Voter suppression is a much more dangerous problem that needs to be addressed by the next government. Your thoughts?
I think that there's voter suppression to some extent. I think it's undeniable. I happen to feel that in 2020, and this is by anecdotal scenarios, but vast and massive anecdotal scenarios, that the voter suppression is via Democrats against Republicans because they're trying to threaten and scare them via these lootings and riots and so forth. Voter suppression by Republicans towards Democrats, and this is clearly political. I don't see it. I don't see anything in any manner, shape, or form where conservatives are doing things that are suppressive against liberal people and trying not to have them vote.
What about, though, I mean, the idea of, there's been, the robocalls that go out. There's some campaign operatives, two operatives, Republican operatives who have been indicted, I believe, in two states, Ohio and Michigan, for sending out robocalls that misdirected people in terms of where they're supposed to go and what they need on election day. Are those, in your estimation, isolated instances?
Well, certainly they're isolated incidents. And I obviously Democrats do the same similar types of antics. And I'm not throwing a softball at the Republicans who do that. There no doubt are people on both sides of the aisle that carry out trickery like that. By the way, there's all kinds of alleged voter suppression or voter tampering or voter interference that's not illegal that we've been talking about in the news for a couple years. Things like just trying to sway people's votes through Facebook ads or Facebook posts or Twitter posts or all kinds of different persuasive activities that aren't illegal. I don't even know if you would say that they're immoral. I've talked about before, Barack Obama publicly, openly tried to sway the election in Israel against Benjamin Netanyahu by saying all kinds of negative things about him. But what he did was not illegal because he had an interest in his mind of what could occur even in another country. In the United States, people certainly have a right to engage in all kinds of free speech dialogue, which that's something we should be concerned about that's under attack, is our free speech rights and being able to say what we want in either direction about candidates and to try to persuade people through legal manners and putting up different things that might quote unquote sound like trickery are not necessarily legal.
We're talking with Ken Del Vecchio. He is a legal analyst, a former judge, prosecutor, criminal defense attorney. Ken is also a film producer, director. He has been involved. He has produced more than 30 films. He is the founder of the Hoboken International Film Festival, which is one of the 10 largest in the world. And so, Ken, I want you to put on your hat in terms of a filmmaker here, because I pulled two ads that struck me as interesting, one from each campaign. And these are ads that are largely not in Donald Trump's voice, largely not in Joe Biden's voice in the Biden ad, but both of them seem to be sort of positive cinematic sort of efforts to try to get across what the main themes may be for each campaign. And I'm going to play for you first. Here's the Biden ad. It's called Never Underestimate Joe Biden for President. I'm going to lose myself. And Joe Biden's voice. It was the voice of this kid who had a stuttering problem, who was able to reach out to the Joe Biden campaign, met Joe Biden, and it shows sort of the empathy, the compassion that I think the Biden campaign wants to promote, while at the same time visually trying to hit all the different groups that the Biden campaign feels like is important in terms of their election. People who feel like there needs to be sort of a softer, perhaps gentler approach to people who have been left behind. But anyway, that's my view. Ken, your thoughts on the ad?
Well, fair enough. First of all, as a filmmaker, partisan all aside, it was a very well made ad. It was very visually and aesthetically pleasing. Utilizing a kid in that age range, he looked like I guess a tween, maybe somewhere between 12 to 14 years old, who was very well spoken, intelligent, who had his story to tell. I could see that why that would be appealing to a not just a Democrat audience, but a moderate audience, like a moderate independents. I don't buy into the content of it. However, I'm completely opposed to what I think the Democrats have turned into, is it basically an identity politics type of group largely, and I think it's almost pandering to constantly be pointing to different groups of people. I'd rather we all just be looked at as people and not by the color of our skin, our religion, our ethnicity, or our gender. And I think that type of thing is annoying. So I think that is a potential turnoff to people that are even independents. That said, the overall message of, hey, we're here to help everybody equally, I really feel that that's a message that's across the board of both political parties at this point, David. I think that you have your extremists on both sides that don't feel that way. I unabashedly will say, as a white male, don't count me out as a white male. Don't count my son out as a white male. So that kid was a white male. In that regard, that I like to see that the white male is not counted out there, but I don't think that that's what Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are working towards with the far left that's controlling Biden's campaign. I think they're working towards counting out us as white males and making us marginalized and making us a de facto minority.
Well, that's a debate for another day, but I agree with your sentiments about the ad. Here's the Donald Trump ad, which just struck me because, again, there's no voice of Donald Trump in this. In fact, there's no narration at all. But to me, it gets to there's this sort of movement of people out there behind Donald Trump who feel something special, feel a connection to each other and to him. And I thought this ad captured it pretty well. Anyway, you take a look. Here it is. I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. Sorry, I got to get rid of the Biden one. And let's play. Here it is. Action packed.
Boom! Enthusiasm, strength, winning, patriotism, America. That's what that ad says. I mean, that is like I've never even seen that ad before. That ad was compelling. I mean, it what majestic is the word. It showed bigness. When you, as a filmmaker, you always, especially if you're like an independent filmmaker and you don't have a real lot of money, you always want to show bigness. Now, obviously, the Donald Trump campaign has a lot of money. That ad speaks volumes of bigness. It's showing these big crowds. It's showing this enthusiasm behind him, and it's showing winning. Just look at the imagery of the guy racing down with the horse, and it shows the patriot. It shows patriotism in every way, and that is Donald Trump's base. It's like, let's go America. Let's win. Let's succeed. Let's be positive. Versus the negative that Joe Biden seems to be perpetuating. That ad I really do think is a complete winner.
Well, again, to me, I mean, I'll never forget. I mean, the first political convention that I covered, and my mentor, and I don't want to mention him because people say, oh, because it's a charged name. But anyway, he said, look, I mean, you got to respect the fact that people who go to political conventions, who wear funny hats and different stuff, that they're passionate about politics. Most of them are good people, and they just have this sort of passion. They love policies and issues and everything that goes along with it. And there's nothing wrong necessarily with being passionate. And I think that's something that a lot of people, perhaps in the media, tend to sort of forget about Donald Trump. And I haven't seen a ton of coverage, but I think it's one reason why some Democrats who are the smarter Democrats are a little bit nervous tonight, because there has been a level of enthusiasm with the large crowds that Donald Trump has had for the last several weeks. He's drawing, tens of thousands of people at each of his rallies, and they share something, and they share some sort of movement that I think is going to be around long after Donald Trump, if he loses tomorrow, long after he leaves. So, and again, I think to your point, I agree. I mean, that ad struck me as, okay, yeah, that ad encapsulates that pretty well. That it's, there's nothing wrong with people being passionate for whatever their cause is, as long as it's a peaceful cause. And of course, there's the argument that, well, Donald Trump has stoked divisions in this country. That's not the argument that's not the point that I'm making. My point is that I think when you can have a piece of video that captures something that a lot of people may have missed, to me, it strikes me as interesting.
Yeah. You know what? The most divisive issue ever is abortion, right? Well, right. I happen to think along in the same vein, even though I'm totally pro-life at the highest level, and I believe abortion's wrong at every stage. I do believe that the vast majority of people who believe that abortion should be legal are not evil people. They're good people that I believe that are just misguided. They equate legality with morality. So for people who don't like the Donald Trump voters, don't call us the intolerables. Understand that we're passionate for good reasons. And maybe, just maybe, after this cycle of election is over, we can get together and rationally discuss issues. And I'd like to just bring up one legal point that kind of tenders to that before we get wrapped up here. I'll try to be very quick on, David, is the Joe Biden versus Donald Trump, whether they've committed crimes, with reference to the entire thing over in Ukraine. All right. Neither one of them likely is guilty of a crime. Now, Donald Trump, I don't believe, is guilty of a crime, but I'll get to him second. Joe Biden very likely did not commit a crime in telling the government of the Ukraine that if you don't fire this particular prosecutor, we're not going to give you $1 billion in aid. There are lots of conservatives out there saying he definitely committed a crime. Well, here's how he didn't. If Joe Biden legitimately believed that an American citizen, no less his own son, was being wrongfully persecuted via a wrongful investigation, and he had evidence to believe that, and he said to the Ukrainian government, if you don't fire this guy who's investigating my son and people that are Americans that are involved with a company over there, illegal, that are doing that illegally, then the U.S. government's not going to give you $1 billion in aid. However, if Joe Biden didn't have that rational, reasonable belief, and he was just using his muscle as the vice president to stop a lawful investigation of his son, then he was committing a crime. Conversely, Donald Trump was not committing a crime where he said, you know what? I think Joe Biden may have very well committed a crime by forcing the government to fire this prosecutor, and in exchange for it, gave him $1 billion, and he should be investigated for that. And we're not going to give you $1 billion in aid if you don't investigate. Donald Trump clearly had a reasonable belief that a crime may have been committed where an investigation should have occurred. And I wish that both sides could think about things rationally like that, where there's a good chance that neither one of them committed crimes, and stop using criminal law for political gain.
Rational thought. Well, on the eve of an election, perhaps the most highly charged election we've had in our lifetime, and certainly perhaps the highest participation, I'm not sure rational thought is in the cards right now, but it's a good try, Ken Del Vecchio. I got one more ad I want to show everybody, and I think this is the best ad of all. Here it is. It'll self-explain itself. Watch. So that's the show that Ken Del Vecchio will be part of in the future. That's the show we do every day. It's 15 minutes. We publish around 5 o'clock each day. We have a group of journalists which talk about the top stories across the United States and around the world. Quick Hits News. We also do this live coverage like what we're doing now and talking to Ken Del Vecchio, our legal analyst. So find us through our YouTube page, Quick Hits News. QuickHitsTV.com is our webpage. We're on Twitter, Periscope, Facebook, LinkedIn, the whole bit. And you can support us, and you can get all the news. Just, if 15 minutes is all you need to get caught up with the top stories from across the United States and around the world. No BS. We have a little bit of opinion here and there, and Ken will certainly bring some of his opinion, but we have also the other side that will bring some opinion and informed and logical opinion as well. So there you have it. Ken, thanks for doing this, my friend.
You got it. A+ on that ad from a filmmaking perspective, by the way, and A+ with Quick Hits News. I'm very excited to now be the legal editor and joining all these great journalists and seeing it with an anchor type fashion and hearing both sides of the coin is very refreshing.
It certainly is, and something long overdue, and we're going to need a lot of that, I hope, in the next months and years to come. Ken Del Vecchio. Ken, thank you very much on behalf of everybody at HAPS TV and Quick Hits News. I'm David Schuster. Thanks for watching.